On today's episode, Amy's PHT success story. Welcome to the podcast helping you overcome your proximal hamstring tendinopathy. This podcast is designed to help you understand this condition, learn the most effective evidence-based treatments, and of course, bust the widespread misconceptions. My name is Brodie Sharpe. I'm an online physiotherapist, recreational athlete, creator of the Run Smarter series, and a chronic proximal hamstring tendinopathy battler. Whether you are an athlete or not, this podcast will educate and empower you in taking the right steps to overcome this horrible condition. So let's give you the right knowledge along with practical takeaways in today's lesson. A special shout out to Alicia, who's a keen, avid listener of the podcast, who messaged me several weeks ago now saying I could really use a PHT success story right about now. Took a couple of weeks, sorry Alicia, but we eventually got there. Hopefully this is enlightening and inspirational and strikes a lot of positivity for you. I have done an Amy success story in the past. I'm doing too many success stories, people having to double up with the same names, but this is a different Amy from what we've already listened to. And here's her story. Amy, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's dive into your story. I think it might be good to start off with just an introduction of who you are, where you're from, and what sort of like athletic backgrounds you come from.
Sure. My name is Amy Beck. I live in San Francisco, California. I'm a pediatrician. I am a runner. I started running probably in medical school for stress reduction. And I didn't really run that far or that often at the time, but during my medical training. And then really actually after having children and then trying to kind of get back in shape after pregnancies and all of that, I started to run more often. And then I don't know, something like in 2017 when it was 2018. Yeah. And something clicked and I just started running a lot and got much more into it and started doing road races and trail races and then some half marathons and one marathon in 2019. So,
okay. Do you have like a favorite distance or a favorite terrain that you prefer?
Well, I really love trails, but it's a little hard for me to run on trails on a regular basis. But I do like signing up for trail races and we do, as a family, we do a lot of hiking. That's the nice thing about Northern California. We have like a lot of beautiful trails and places to hike. And then for a road, I've enjoyed the half marathons a lot that I've done. So yeah.
Nice. We're going to get into your PHT injury, but I thought I'd ask, prior to that, had you had any significant running related injuries that halted your running progress?
No, I didn't. And it's sort of interesting in thinking back, because I trained for a marathon in 2019 and I didn't get injured. And then, why, after all of that. But, in retrospect, I do think that in training for certain things, I was following a training plan. And I think that may have been protective because I was following something that was sort of set out by someone who, had a good idea of like what would be a good, type of a good, progression and a good advance in terms of mileage. And so, but yeah, no, before PHT, I guess I did have a little bout of piriformis syndrome, maybe a few months before I got the PHT, but it was pretty mild. And I think I rested for 2 weeks and did some stretching and it got better. But
Right. Okay. Well, your onset of PHT, how long ago was that?
So I think it actually very early first started back in February of 2020. I actually distinctly remember we had gone skiing and I was, running and feeling this pain and I was thinking, could I have done something skiing? But it just didn't really make sense to me because I don't know, I hadn't fallen, etc. But I did feel, some deep, buttock pain. And then it was sort of be there at the start of the run and then actually get better as the run, as I was running. And so I was doing some reading, and I thought, oh, just based on the location of the pain, like this is probably PHT. And I just started doing some bridges and it got better. But then, that was February 2020, and then the pandemic started. And, there was a long period of time when, we have young kids and they were not, in school or childcare. And so I basically just stopped really having any time to exercise. And then in just kind of like November 2020, we had like a better childcare situation, and I started to run again. And then I think I started to use running as a kind of to just help with like stress and anxiety, maybe more so than I had done in the past. And I think I kind of got in the mindset of like, well, running makes me feel good. The more I run, the better I'll feel, and kind of ramped up. And then the symptoms came back, and then, they just got much worse at that point. So I tried the
Okay.
bridges, and, I didn't really see any improvement. So.
Right. Well, I guess it kind of makes sense why the PHT would appear from skiing in the first place. Like you're looking at like a slightly bent over crouch type of exercise where you're utilizing, well, your glutes a lot, but I think that constant bending over is putting compression on that upper hamstring quite a lot.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
maybe in combination with some running, maybe was enough to, trigger some sort of stimulus to create pain, but seems like based on life circumstances, there wasn't enough challenging running or regular running to notice if it was sticking around or whether those initial bridges were effective enough to really sort of get rid of it for good.
It kind of like went dormant because my running went dormant.
Exactly. And so returning to running, once everything back up again, you mentioned that you might have done a little bit too much. Are you talking about like progressing the distance or maybe the frequency per week?
I think both. I mean, I went from not running much at all, and I went up to 5 times a week pretty quickly. And then, yeah, definitely distance. I mean, I was running maybe like 4 to 5 miles on weekdays, like 3 times a week, and then like a one longer run on the weekends. And I think just increasing the distance of that longer run pretty fast. And I mean, there were no races or anything. It was just kind of, I felt like I wanted to have that feeling of like challenging myself and, increasing distance. And so I think I just was pushing it too far.
Do you think it was a gradual onset or was there like one moment, one run when like afterwards it increased symptoms? What was that onset like?
It was definitely gradual. It was like, oh, there's that feeling again. Oh, but then, you would run and I would feel it for like miles 1 and 2, and then it would get better. Um, and then, so I feel like December 2020, I was having symptoms with running, but it wasn't, it was more the sort of nagging, like low grade pain. And then like January, February, it sort of really ramped up. And then I would have pain after the run. And then I like developed the pain with sitting, and with driving in particular, being in the car. So, and then I feel like it just like took on a life of its own. Like I cut back on the running and the pain got worse. And, the sitting pain, like it felt like each week my tolerance for sitting went down. So,
Yeah. It sounds like very similar for, say, tendinopathies in general, but plantar fasciitis especially. It seems to really gradually come on and to the point where it doesn't really bother you, but then it just hangs around for a couple of weeks. And you're like, oh, yeah, there's that symptom again. And not until it starts to disrupt things that it becomes a bit more like that urgency starts to creep up. Whereas before, like the level of urgency is quite low. It's like, oh yeah, I can still run. Running's actually pain free once I've warmed up, and let's just see how it goes. And then, like you say, carries over into daily activities, sitting, driving. Sometimes with PHT, people are like bending, stretching, picking things up off the floor, like that sort of again starts to irritate and carry over into those particular tasks. Did you
Oh
did you
yeah.
notice that for you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like just, my kids, like their beds are kind of low. And so just like bending over at night to like kiss them, I would be like, oh, mommy doesn't want to do this. And so yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And any stretching, of the hamstring was super painful. So
Yeah, quite tough as well when your initial running, like you say, is for mental health and sort of relieving of stress and anxiety. Did you have to take much of a reduction in terms of, or was your running restricted or affected in any way?
yeah, I mean, I can't remember exactly when, but I think at some point in February of 2020, I just stopped running entirely. I mean, I was even having pain with like long walks. And so yeah, I think that
Hmm.
probably my total like not running at all was, I don't know, 8 or 9 weeks, I want to say. And then I like started to see a physical therapist. Um, and then after that, I found I found your podcast and video course.
Yay. Right.
Yeah, and that was very positive. But yeah, I think it was at least 8 or 10 weeks that I didn't run at all.
Was the decision to take the running time off, was that based on, oh, let me just give it some rest and see if it gets any better? Or did you think that, maybe let me try another thing? So you substituted running for something else to see if it improved.
No, I thought if I keep running, this is going to get worse, and I just was worried that I was making it worse by running. And yeah, and it was just too uncomfortable, honestly, because
Hmm.
it would flare up so much after a run that I would be taking ibuprofen, and I didn't want to be taking like so much, like, I don't know,
Yeah.
to be taking NSAIDs on a regular basis like that. And so it felt like I just needed to stop. And I mean, there's so much information out there. So there are people who are like, you will not heal your PHT if you do not stop running. Other people will, you must continue running. So yeah, so for about 8 or 9 weeks, I stopped. I mean, at least I stopped running entirely. I was still doing some walking, but
Okay. Well, what was your experience when you stopped running? Did you notice an improvement in your symptoms, say like with sitting and those daily tasks?
no, I will say not particularly. And I think that was very frustrating because I wouldn't say it got worse, but I definitely felt like I stopped running, and I kind of thought that the like worst of the symptoms that were, like as you said, sort of impacting your day to day, that those would resolve because this was quote unquote caused by running. But that, that just, it didn't happen. It felt like the pain was sitting almost sort of accelerated. Yeah. And everything just kind of either certain symptoms were like stagnant, but, I also had pain kind of down the back of my leg as a little bit as well. And yeah, it did not get better with stopping running. So,
Yeah. Well, it's a principle I talk about a lot. It's usually with running related injuries, it'd make intuitive sense that I just need to take time off and wait for symptoms to settle because the body does an amazing job of healing itself. And I'll just get back to running and happy days. But, most often that's not the case. If anything, if symptoms do get better from complete rest, you know, the return back to running almost causes symptoms again because you haven't actively addressed the capacity of that particular structure. Because if you continue to run with it, it gets weaker or it gets more sensitive. A sensitive structure like reduces its adaptation zone. And so you're sort of resting and deconditioning that whole tendon or that whole muscle unit. And yeah, makes sense. And especially if it gets to the point where that particular level of irritation and that particular strength is so low that sitting irritates it or bending forward irritates it, then we're removing the running, further contributing to weakness. But, those daily tasks that continue to irritate it, there's no long-term strategy for recovery. And you did mention taking an extended time off, and then you mentioned starting some PT. Where was that when you started doing that? Where in the rest period Was that implemented?
It was pretty early on. I think it was like about a week or two in, I was like, okay, I got to do something. And I did, I mean, I had started the bridges again because that had been helpful, with the very, very initial symptoms that I'd had. Although that was at that point, that was, practically a year, prior. But I didn't really see improvement. And so I went to see a physical therapist, um, and I mean, I think there were certain things that she definitely got right. I mean, she said like, you need hamstrings. I think she said to use the word dynamic recovery. She said, you don't want to stop all activity. You need to kind of find the right zone. And she did start me with hamstring strengthening pretty early on. Um, but she also really, I think what she didn't know is that you shouldn't be stretching. And
Okay.
so she was encouraging me to stretch, and even like, having me stretch during the sessions. And my sense was it was making things worse, but it's hard. I feel like when you're getting advice from someone, you feel like, well, let me give this a try, and see what's going to happen. And so I think the first couple of weeks, I think that the stretching, any benefit I was getting from the, starting some strengthening, was just sort of offset by, really, it was just getting really worse, with the stretching. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, so that's why I was so like, when I found your podcast and then the video course, and I already felt like the stretching was making it worse. And there's just like hearing like, you know, don't stretch. This is not going to work well for this injury. And then you need to take this sort of progressive strengthening approach, and adding weight and adding load. That was all, just so helpful. And the physical therapist, I kind of just shared a lot of the information with her, and she was really open to it, and also very, very good about helping me to like make a program, based on that information. It's like, okay,
Excellent.
you think you're at this stage, like let's try these specific exercises. And so, yeah. So
Sounds like
once
a great PT.
yeah. So once I stopped stretching and kind of convinced her that that was not a good idea, I think she also like had this, and I feel like you've mentioned this before. Maybe other guests of yours have mentioned this, that she thought that part of the problem was like related to like pelvic positioning and like like kind of like, I guess not
Yeah.
anteversion of the pelvis. And I mean, yeah, I don't know. So I was doing certain exercises for that, but I wasn't really seeing specific benefit from them. But I think around like week 3 of seeing her, I started doing like some of the Nordic dips. And then I started doing bridges also, like with, my legs elevated. Um, and I think even just that 1 week of a little bit more, you know, load and a little bit more compression, I noticed improvements.
Mm.
And then, yeah, and then the deadlifts.
Good. Yes, we'll talk about the deadlifts in a second.
Yeah.
One thing that I want to bring up with the stretching is, you know, there's it sort of swings in a couple of directions. Like if 10 years ago, people were like, oh yeah, stretch PHT, stretch your hamstring injury because that's going to help alleviate symptoms. Found out
Yeah.
that's not really the case. It's not really helpful to recovery. But then people with PHT read that stretching's no good and they sort of swing in the other direction and say, okay, all stretching is bad.
Mm,
And they sort of develop a fear and anxiety around stretching. And so then they do their strengthening. And even when they get a lot better, they just persist for months and years of just really scared about stretching because they fear that it's going to come back or exacerbate or it's
mm,
bad. And so that's kind of like the protective sort of overreaction to
mm,
that advice. And so where I tend to sit on it now that I've seen the swing in both directions is like anything, your hamstring can tolerate a certain amount of stretch, and we want to try and make sure that when it is irritated, yeah, it probably can't tolerate a lot of stretch. So it's probably best that we don't do static stretches or overstretch. But then when it settles down, you sort of want to develop the tolerance to stretch because you need to stretch it for everyday life, to pick something up off the floor, to, if you want to do some cycling, or if you want to sit, like all of that's like a low level of stretching that needs to be tolerated. And
Hmm.
so, and if your goal is to return to stretching or yoga classes or Pilates or those sorts of things, then like you do with strength, you just build up that tolerance with a progressive strengthening, not a progressive strengthening, but a stretching sort of regime,
Yeah.
so that you don't sort of, you're not left with those anxieties of, oh my God, I can't stretch this injury because it's going to make things worse. And so, um, would you feel in agreement with that?
Yeah. I mean, now I do stretch, not a ton, but
Good.
yeah. I mean, prior to this, I used to do this like bar workout. Not, super religiously, but, do it a couple of times a week here and there. Just using, I mean, before I had kids, I used to go in person, and then, then it was a little too much, so I would do some of their, video and streaming. And there was a lot of stretching. So I kind of missed it. When when I stopped, because it actually, it feels good, etc. And so, yeah, more recently, I have resumed, stretching both my hamstring and my quads. But yeah, and like you said, yeah, being able to bend over and pick something up.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it was just in that very acute phase of, yeah, that the stretching, and also sort of having someone else do this, the stretching for you. It just, like, I noticed like almost immediately that, it kind of flared the pain up. And so,
Mm.
um, but yeah, I do stretch now.
Good. I'm glad. Well, I'm glad that you actually found the podcast and the online course, because someone can really easily be assigned stretches and strengthening exercises and then and not get better, and then you scrap both of them and say, no, this isn't working. You can immediately sort of dismiss the strengthening exercises because you're not getting better. So I'm glad that you sort of came to the realization, okay, let me remove just the stretching, let me keep the strengthening, and then move forward from there. So when
Yeah.
did things actually sort of, when did the needle start to move towards recovery? When did you start seeing some sort of progress being made?
I think it was probably about 6 weeks in, when, I don't remember the like exact sequence, but I was doing the Nordic dips, and doing the bridges and with my legs up, and I started doing the Swiss ball rollouts. And I mean, they were really hard, and they, like, it was painful when I did them, but I just started light. And then I started with the single leg, I don't know, my PT would call them our Romanian deadlifts, like the single leg
Yeah, you
with
could
like
do
a,
single leg deadlifts.
yeah, like with a kettlebell. Um,
Hmm.
and that, and then, yeah, then I moved on to, like, actual, I mean, I just got a barbell and plates, because our gym was still, there was not really a lot of opportunities for, going to the gym and equipment. And so I just was doing everything with home equipment. But I think about 6 weeks into sort of progressive strengthening, I started to feel quite a bit better. And I mean, I was still having pain, and I was still having pain with sitting. And then I think basically in May, so it's probably be like 8 or 9 weeks of not running, I started to run, but very, very, small amounts initially. Um, we also got a dog at the end of April, who's a very active dog. And so I think even just, I mean, even this, like the walking I was doing with him, I started to just jog a little bit, because he is just a very hyper and, just one of these dogs who needs a lot of exercise. And so then kind of slowly built up from there.
Yeah. So you mentioned the bridges, you increased to putting your feet up on an elevated surface. You mentioned the Nordic hip dips would
Mhm.
be like, strapping your foot underneath something and then dipping forward at the
Yeah.
hips. So kind of bending at the hips rather than doing your traditional Nordic drop, which is like you keep your whole body straight and sort of drop towards the ground. Um, you mentioned single leg deadlifts. You mentioned getting a bar and sort of starting to do heavier stuff with that. Did you have any particular guidelines in terms of how to progress, when to progress, what pain to follow? How would you know when it's time to progress? What sort of parameters did you have?
Well, I mean, you had a lot of great information in the course, so I tried to, I tried to sort of assess basically like how did it feel during the exercise and then how did it feel after the exercise, and tried to go with, if there's some discomfort during the exercise, that's okay, as long as I wasn't worse the next day that I than I had been previously. And I felt like, at least for the all of the strengthening exercises that I was doing, that worked pretty well. I kind of, I mean, I think I had a lot of apprehension, and you could have talked about this, and people have a lot of apprehension initially, and they're worried that anything that is going to kind of put any strain on the tendon, is going to make the pain worse. And so, um, I think, the first few weeks I wasn't using any actual weight. But yeah, then once I started, just tried to just, be very gradual about it. And yeah, just slowly increase. And I mean, at that point, I actually was going to seeing the physical therapist twice a week. And so and then I went to once a week and then every other week. So she was really good about saying, okay, you've done, this many sets or this weight. And like, I think it seems like you're ready for the next thing, and helping me with the form, and making sure that, that was, good, so that I mean, I was worried. I was like, oh, am I going to do deadlifts? I'm going to hurt my back. So, yeah, so she was really helpful with all of that. And then
Yeah.
eventually adding in some of the, like the plyometric exercises, too, which I feel like maybe it was probably about 8 weeks before I started doing any of that.
Okay.
But yeah.
What were the plyometric exercises?
Um, just like a lot of, I'm like jumping, like the back and forth.
Yeah.
I forget what they're all called, but
Was that like a lunge? So you go into a lunge, jump up, swap sides, and
yeah,
go
yeah,
into
yeah.
another
I
lunge?
did that, and then and yeah, and just like hopping back and forth over a line, and forward and
Hmm.
back, side to side. Um, these other ones, I forget what they're called, but where you sort of jump and then put one leg kind of behind the other, and then back in the other direction. um but and I mean, again, similarly, like at the start of each one I was like, oh, this is gonna like, is this gonna
Yeah.
flare things up, etc. But just starting gradually, increasing, paying attention, seeing how I felt the next day. And I think when I first started to run, there was this challenge of, could I run and then, even though the running was a lot of mostly walking, but could I, do any running and then do the strength training on the same day? And initially I couldn't. It was too much, So if I did, some, deadlifts and like a sort of a full, what I kind of considered like my PT session, and then tried to run on the same day, I felt like that would, it was not good, and I would have a lot more pain the next day. And so then I
Hmm.
realized I just needed to alternate, because for a while when I wasn't running, I was actually doing the PT exercises, something every single day.
Well, it's just about running a test, right? It's like, okay, can I handle my strength and run on the same day? Well, how about we don't do all of your strength, we just do some of it, and then we just do a little run, do that in the same day, and see how you feel the next day. And if symptoms are increased, you're probably like, okay, might not be ready for that.
Yeah.
Um, I did, but you did mention when you started doing the heavier sort of stuff, the apprehension or, nervous to say, okay, is this going to flare up my tendon? And I guess the more you do it and the more you progress, the more you increase your confidence as well.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of PHT clients like try a deadlift or try an exercise and they're like, oh yeah, I just go down until the point where I feel pain and then I come back up. And often I think when that's the case, you sort of want to go through that slight, stretchy, uncomfortable symptom for a bit. Like if you're doing, say, a deadlift, go beyond the point where you feel that stretch because, like you say, people start being fearful and they say, okay, let me just do it all pain free. But I actually encourage people to do a range of movement that does provoke some of that discomfort, because otherwise you're not providing that stimulus for the tendon. Actually, it's what they enjoy, provided that it's not irritated afterwards. And so if
Yeah.
someone does a deadlift through a bit of discomfort and it's maybe a 2 or 3 out of 10 during and quickly settles afterwards, you're probably into the right sweet spot. Did you find that particularly for you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I definitely realized that I had to be okay with, with some pain during, and that some pain during the PT exercises did not necessarily was not a bad thing. And oftentimes I felt like when I was in the sweet spot, like I would like even by the next day, I would feel like, oh, I feel better, or
Mm.
I feel stronger. I have more tolerance for sitting, et cetera. Um, so yeah, no, I definitely, um, I had to, I had to kind of play around with that. And like you said, just feel comfortable. And I mean, I made mistakes too. I'm not so much with the strength training, but I mean, with, the returning to running, like just, having, after a while, I got to the point where kind of where I had been initially, where I would only have pain at the beginning of a run, and it would start to go away. And so that was sort of dangerous because then I would tell
Yeah.
myself, like, oh, I can keep going because I feel
Mhm.
good. And then at least 2 or 3 times, really overdid it, ran too far, and then, the next, even within a few hours, like, had a much more of a flare up. So
Did you have a written down structure of, like, returning to running and how much to increase and that sort of stuff?
I did not, I just, well, I
How
mean,
dare you?
yeah, I was very structured, like with the strength, because I had the physical therapist, and she would, kind of verbally tell me things and also write them down for me. So that part, I felt like there was a lot of structure. Um, and then returning to running, I mean, I kind of just started with like, let me walk and then I'll run a few blocks and then I'll walk the rest. And then then eventually I progressed to, for 1 mile, I would walk a block, run a block, walk a block, run a block. Um, but then, eventually I was like, oh, I can run a couple of miles. And then, yeah, the like crazy runner mind, you're like, oh, if I can run 2, I can run 4. Or there was one day
Mm,
where I had, you know, in the prior week had been able to run 4 twice. And I was like, oh, I can run 7. Like, no, 4 to
okay.
7 is like a really big step up and
Yep.
not a good idea. But so,
I think we're identifying a bit of a missing link here in not only your recovery, but what happened to the injury in the first place. Like you said, in the past, you've trained for a marathon following a plan and everything went well. And then all of a sudden, once you started increasing your running without a plan, developed the PHT. And then
yeah,
upon your rehab sort of phase, you had a plan for your strength and conditioning, all went well, and then didn't have a plan for the running, and that caused a couple of flare ups and setbacks. And you could probably um, accurately assume that if you did have a running plan, you'd probably return a lot quicker because, every little flare up has a little setback and um, delays that recovery. I was going to ask about flare ups if you encountered any flare ups throughout your rehab, but it sounded like those, from you sharing that, it did sound like you did have a couple. How did you deal with that sort of mentally? I know a lot of people, they see initial success and then they have a setback and they're thinking, oh, am I always going to have this? Is this ever going to go away? What if I keep doing the wrong thing? Were you able
yeah.
to, was your mentality okay whenever those symptoms increased?
I think by the time I was at the point where, I mean, literally it was like 1 week running 4 miles, and then I decided to, do a long run and ran 7. I think at that point I had learned enough to realize like, oh, that was just a foolish mistake, and that was really not a smart thing to do. But probably it's going to be okay if I, step back, and it just was sort of able to take it in stride. I think there were a couple of times earlier when it was a much smaller step that caused a flare up, like, oh, just running for just a slightly more distance, that I think I was more worried and frustrated, and more concerned about that like sense of chronicity. Is this ever going to
Mm.
go away? But again, here, the some of your podcasts were really helpful, and just thinking about. I think there was uh, just realizing that sort of catastrophic thinking in and of itself is very harmful, and is not. It's just once you get into that mindset, you're not thinking critically, and you're not sort of recognizing what are the patterns, and what are the steps that you can take. And so trying to just kind of pull myself back from from that abyss of like, I'm never going to run again, I'm never going to do a race again, etc.
Mm.
And I was able to sort of reframe. But and then I think also just the accepting, which took me a little while, but accepting that it was going to be a long process, that
Mm.
this wasn't going to be a 2-month injury or a 1-month injury. It was going to be a multi-month injury. And um but still healable and curable, something that could get better, but was not going to get better quickly. So
Yeah, I think a nice lesson to have, and it's quite reassuring when you say that the flare-ups that got you down the most was making the most gradual increase in that exacerbating symptoms. Reassuring for people who are injured to know that yes, you do need to be patient and you do need to take those steps really gradually. But when you're starting from baseline, like you hadn't ran for 10 weeks and you're just getting started, you're pretty much starting from the ground up. And when you start from the ground up, it's almost harder to get from 0Ks to 5Ks, or like from 0 minutes of running to 30 minutes of running. It's harder to do that than to go from 30 minutes to 60 minutes. It's almost
yeah.
like you develop a bit of stability and foundation along the way. And then going from a successful 10K to 20K is even easier. And it's just because you're sort of laying that foundation. That foundation takes a lot of time. But once you have a bit more of a robust, resilient tendon and structure, you can just follow those principles. As long as you follow those principles, that those leaps and bounds become easier and easier and easier, and you sort of gather that momentum. And so I know there'd be a ton of people listening to this already that's frustrated with their little flare ups, just making those little increments. And so that reminder can be very reassuring.
Yeah. No, definitely in the beginning it was, very it was very discouraging. But yeah, I think after, I don't know, maybe, I was trying to think back, like how long did it take me to, get to a 10K, which is kind of what I would have considered like a nice good run, like not a super long run, but a run that I would. And I think I think it really took like May, June, July, August. It really took me like 4 to 5 months from starting running again to comfortably running a 10K. So
Mm.
um which
And from there, I guess, what sort of momentum have you managed to build? Like, progressing your strength, progressing your running. What have you progressed towards?
Yeah, so I did 2 half marathons in the spring. And then I started to train for a marathon, but then I had COVID and had kind of a miserable, several weeks with that. And then other life stressors, some family illness and things like that. So the summer has not been great, and then the piriformis syndrome kind of kicked in. But which I'm my most recent injury, but I'm coming back from. But yeah, but it was nice to those 2 half marathons. I absolutely were pain free. So
Excellent. Did you do any particular speed workouts, or is it all just slow running with that build up?
I, I'm trying to think. If I did I do speed workouts before the half marathon? A little bit, but again, not super structured. I do a lot of hills, not it's just because of the neighborhood that I live in. I mean, San Francisco is like incredibly hilly terrain. So we're kind of just always running hills, and which is nice because then if you do a race which is flatter, then you realize how much fitness you've gained from running all the hills. But no, I didn't do any structured speed workout. Sometimes will do like some strides or some, intervals if I'm doing a shorter run, but nothing very concrete or structured.
If like looking back on your whole journey, is there like a couple of key revelations or principles that you think really did help move the needle? Like I know, some might have a bigger impact than others in your eyes, despite like several things actually having benefit. Can you think of anything on top of mind?
So I think, just just sort of recognizing the whole concept of, load versus capacity and that, and just realizing how sort of dynamic, that was going to be over time. And that, in order to get over this injury, I was going to have to do specific exercises, to load the tendon and to, put stress on the tendon, to make it stronger and healthier. Um, and then also, take that same approach, in starting running, and just sort of that interplay, I think was really just understanding that conceptually. And I think, probably it has a lot of parallels with other overuse injuries, but just sort of understanding the nature of overuse injuries and tendinopathies in general, I think was really, really helpful. And, just even though, okay, yeah, maybe we don't understand the exact pathophysiology like at a molecular level for some of these things, but those principles, for me were very helpful. And yeah, I think just recognizing that it was going to be a long path, but that people do get better, from these injuries, that, this is not a life sentence of a PHT necessarily. You can improve.
Yeah. Well said. Is there any other, I guess, final advice that you might have for someone who does have a running related injury or PHT that might be really struggling? Is there any particular words of wisdom or anything that we haven't covered yet that you think you might want to share?
So I do think that I did benefit from, some of the episodes about stress reduction, mindfulness, and, thinking about the impact of stress and stress hormones on recovery and, sleep, all of those things. I think in the beginning, I was thinking about things like very purely mechanistically, like I have this tendon has this problem. I have to load the tendon in this certain way. I have to start loading it into compression, and it was sort of like, I was like a car mechanic, trying
Yeah.
to fix my tendon. And I have this physical therapist who's going to help me figure out the right exercises, et cetera. But I think, that the more holistic approach and, considering those other aspects, I do feel like made a difference. I mean, again, my N of one, and just, the sort of speed of recovery, taking those other things into consideration. And then it's also the sort of the relationship that one has with running. Like you said, it is challenging if you're using running for stress relief and then need to cut back or stop running entirely. I think that, that is difficult. And so trying to have a bigger arsenal of, possible approaches, to deal with stress, recognizing that running is a great one, but, it's probably shouldn't be, your only approach, so that you have some other tools in the toolbox, if you need to cut back on running, and also to sort of squelch a little bit of that desire to, well, if this feels good, if running makes me X amount of distance makes me feel good, then even more is going to be better, because sometimes I think that can lead to overdoing it. So that balance, I mean, I still think running is great for stress relief. And so I think that's like scientifically proven really at this point. But, probably not it. I think people, you need to have something, you need to have other avenues and other approaches. at the same time. So
I'm constantly struggling with clients who only run and need to run because it's their stress relief and they're injured. Like that combination is just really tough to negotiate for, because you're taking away a love and a stress relief, but you're also in pain. Like all of those things are just, it's a really poor experience. And if you don't have any other alternatives, and then on top of that, once you are making those small gains, try and celebrate those, try and focus on those positives of making those gains, because I know a lot of people that do make those gains, like, yeah, well, I'm not running pain-free yet. And then they're running pain-free and they say, no, well, I'm running pain-free, but it's not 10K like I used to. And then they'll probably get to 10K. It's like, yeah, but I'm doing it really slow. I need to be faster. And like, it's never enough. Like, yeah, we can strive to the next step, but celebrate the wins along the way. The more, like you mentioned with the catastrophizing, that sort of stuff, if your mindset is a little bit more positive, it actually helps your recovery and it helps the overall experience.
yeah,
Pain is very, very close linked to misery. And if we can sort of break that cycle and the overall rehab is a little bit more positive in the whole experience, then the enjoyment for appreciating what you can do rather than what you can't do is like, it's just a better journey overall.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I tried to do was to think, okay, what are all the things that I like about running? And can I, is it possible to get some of that in other ways? And it's like, well, I like being outside. Well, if I'm outside and I'm walking, or outside and really, I like having a little time to myself in the morning. It's, like, I mean, my run takes me out to the beach and back. So, I like being able to see the ocean every day, if ever so briefly, et cetera. And so, trying to mentally realize that, yes, there was the actual running and the, endorphins and elevated heart rate and feeling of accomplishment. But, there were other aspects of going for a run that, had these benefits and could be obtained other ways. So,
Yeah. And again, that's looking at the holistic approach. It's looking at, stress, mindset, as well as just the physical, mechanical side of it as well. So I'm
yeah,
very glad. And I guess it all started with you wanting to have a better understanding and sort of investing in the knowledge of the injury itself, rather than just having someone tell you what to do and have someone go through, just write down the instructions. You wanted to actively seek out your own knowledge and understanding of this condition. So credit to you for doing that, and seemed like it was a crucial part into your overall recovery and sort of empowering you a little bit more. And it just carries over. It leads to some good successes, better understanding, not only for this injury, but if another injury was to happen, I'm sure with this piriformis stuff, you're applying the same principles. And if there's
yeah,
another injury down the track, those same principles would apply. And so investing in those knowledge is the ethos of the Run Smarter podcast. And, we can do great things if we invest in a little bit of knowledge. And so thanks for sharing
absolutely.
all those principles, and thanks for coming on and sharing your story.
My pleasure.
Thanks once again for listening and taking control of your rehab. If you are a runner and love learning through the podcast format, then go ahead and check out the Run Smarter podcast, hosted by me. I'll include the link along with all the other links mentioned today in the show notes. So open up your device, click on the show description, and all the links will be there waiting for you. Congratulations on paving your way forward towards an empowering, pain-free future. And remember, knowledge is power.